recently moved. Um, we're now at 100 Glenview Road in Spring Grove. We're not open to the public yet. We're still setting up, and because of COVID restrictions and things like that. So hopefully in a few weeks, we'll be able to open up to the public, at least in some sense, and get some people in there to see what we're doing and everything, and where we're at now. But at some point, we'll have an official grand opening when things settle down. I guess we'll get started. I'll introduce Jim McClure. Everyone pretty much knows who Jim is around here. He doesn't really need much of an introduction. He's going to talk about York County history and adversity. There's going to be some Spring Grove things in there, but generally it's a York County presentation. And if anyone has questions, they can hop on there and turn their audio on and just interrupt him in the middle of his presentation, or throw something in the chat there, and we'll go about it that way. But it's all yours, Jim.
Well, thanks, Blake. Great to be here this afternoon. Thank you and Tracy for setting this up and and giving up part of your Saturday here to do this. As usual, I have a lot of material to do in the amount of time we have, and so I'll be moving pretty fast. And as Blake said, I'd appreciate and enjoy questions as we go. Just interrupt and or wait between slides if I pause and just jump in, and that makes for a better discussion. Maybe we can think about this as a discussion more than a presentation. And as Blake said, I do have some Spring Grove area slides in here. I have an overall York County slides in here. So hopefully I'll be able to hit both audiences. And as we talk about this, I know that a lot of people are hurting right now, and this isn't a presentation about just throw a little dirt on it and it'll heal type of thing. This is, but I do think that we can gain by looking at the past and how we've come through some difficult moments. And the difficult moments in the past tend to come in clusters, just like ours has this past year, where we have, multiple challenges. So I'll just go ahead and plunge right in. These are some things that we'll talk about. Basically we can gain strength from what our York County forebears have done over the years as they've faced challenges. And in fighting through this COVID pandemic and other challenges, we can appreciate the tough fiber of our ancestors. We can appreciate them all the more, what they battled through, just as we're battling through things today. How did we do it? What was our tactic? What were our strategies? We'll talk about that and what lessons we can learn. And just basically, we'll talk about politics at some points here, I think that we'll do it in a way that no one will be offended as we go. You tell me if you want to go deeper than we do on some of these. I'm going to talk about 5 moments. I'm going to concentrate on about 5 moments from the past. And there's others that we could talk about. I'm going to talk about Congress's visit to York and the camp security after that, the challenges those faced. We're going to talk about the Civil War moment and how the multiple things that hit us in the Civil War. We'll talk about World War I and the Spanish flu. And we'll talk about the Great Depression, the polio epidemic in World War II. As I said, these things tend to come in clusters. And, so it's not just one. We have the York race riots in the late 60s. We have, we have the Tropical Storm Agnes 3 years after that, and all that in the middle of the Vietnam War. And then we have our trio, if not more, COVID-19, George Floyd's death and all that meant, and then the presidential election. So there's a lot to talk about, but we've been there before, folks, and each of these, and we've been through public health moments before, crisis before, and so maybe we can learn from those. I'll just start out by saying that why have we been involved in so many of these crises? I mean, not every community has been involved in the Revolutionary War, Civil War, World War II, and so forth as we have. Other communities have, but we've been involved. We certainly have been involved in a big way. Part of that, it has to do with our geography and our age. We're the first county north of the Mason-Dixon line and the first west of the Susquehanna. And you can see from these maps here, if you look at the map to the right there, you can see the Mason-Dixon line. And you know, we had before 1800 about 65 miles of the Mason-Dixon line. The Mason-Dixon line, the original one, I think, was 233 miles. So we had about 25% of the Mason-Dixon line, maybe a little bit more at first. And then after Adams left in 1800, we still had 15% of the Mason-Dixon line. So we have a broad border with the South. And you can see the upper left, you know, we've shortened it to about 45 miles from Delta to Littlestown, or Delta to West Manheim Township, about 45 miles, but it's still an expansive connection with the South and with the Port of Baltimore. And, you know, and so, you know, there's other things to talk about there. You know, we are a large geographic county. We're been in the top 10 in terms of the amount of our acreage that we cover. We've always been among PA's most populous counties. We're a border county and a border state. We're north meets south. We just talked about that. We're the keystone state between the Northeast and the Southeast. And we're most of the mid-Atlantic states, and between we're between the large city of Philadelphia and the large southern city of Baltimore. So we're kind of right in the middle of things. And so we kind of that's connected us in many ways over the years, as we'll plunge into that right now. So we'll start with the American Revolution and the camp security connection. And I think the story is well known out there, how Continental Congress staff and their servants came here in 77, 78. They were staying in our homes. The men were away. So the women were running businesses, farms, and households. They had to deal with the same wartime prices that our founders did. Times of war, there's things just aren't available. A little bit what we've found in this pandemic, that we just can't get stuff. Someone was telling me the other day, it was an appliance dealer, that they have 40 orders backed up for stoves, just for people wanting to buy stoves, or ovens. So, you know, but in those days, you just couldn't get stuff. And so we can feel a little bit of that now. And the women had to really scrounge for things, because in their households, they had these distinguished or, statesmen that were staying with them. And yet they still were in routines. And there's one story I like to tell involving statesman Timothy Pickering, who was from Massachusetts, and he was staying at the Widow Mimmons here in York. And I'll just read this real quickly. I've not felt as much at home since I left Salem, Massachusetts. The Widow Mimmons lived all alone and now sits from morning till night at her spinning wheel, which, by the way, is a very modest one. And when I'm at home writing or reading, it gives me no more disturbance than the purring of a cat. So here you have a picture of the Widow Mimmons working quietly behind the scenes. She was a widow, so who was she making stuff for? She was making stuff for others. She was spinning and sewing for others, including maybe the military. So she was not only running the household and hosting Pickering, but she was also making, goods for the war effort, I believe. And that the Continental Congress was here for 9 months. They left in June 1778, but yet in 1781, the very enemy we were fighting came to town. They were brought here from Charlottesville, Virginia, to try to get away from the advancing, the British who were coming up from the south. And so we have camp security that's now in Springsbury Township, and we had a public health crisis. We had a bad case or cases of camp fever, which was probably some form of typhus that erupted out there in camp security. And camp security provided other types of challenges. I mean, the soldiers were, many of them, the British soldiers, were on parole, so they could walk our streets, and the very people we were fighting were here in our midst. Imagine if that happened today, how disconcerting that would be. So you can see the multiple layers of things that we had to live with just in this one war, and somehow we made it through. Okay, again, interrupt me if you have questions as we go here today. Now we go to the Civil War era, and again, we've talked a lot about this. I think I'll go through this quickly. That we had Camp Scott at the old fairgrounds, not where the current fairgrounds are, but at the old fairgrounds, which was at southeast of King and Queen Streets, at about the location of Hennepin Middle School. And we had tens of thousands of Green troops drilling here. These were Union troops drilling here early in the war. And later on, we hosted a military hospital. You can see the numbers there, a major league, big military hospital. We had an invasion of the Confederates. About 11,000 Confederates crossed our soil in the days before the Battle of Gettysburg. We had more than 600 die in the war, and the disruption was such that we had to form an orphanage. Now it's the Children's Home of York, and we had the York Benevolent Association formed at that time as well. It's still with us today. And York Hospital was an offshoot of the military hospital, not necessarily a direct connection, but many of the surgeons who treated patients here during the Civil War were at York Hospital when it formed in 1880. Here's a story about one very veteran nurse, Cassandra Small Morris, and her niece wrote about her. This is a veteran nurse after she dealt with some of the wounded at Gettysburg. She was terrified beyond all, didn't take her clothes off at night for more than a week, sat up in a chair, couldn't sleep at all, looked miserably, and never smiled. Think about the PTSD, just evident here in this one veteran seasoned nurse, based on everything she saw in Gettysburg and the types of wounded that were being brought here from the battlefield. So a big moment in New York, a big disruptive moment. And again, we fought through, went into the Industrial Revolution, built all those big red brick buildings that were familiar around York, and really recovered from that, but it wasn't easy. So that's the Civil War. Now we move to World War I. And not only did we have World War I, but we had a terrible Spanish flu pandemic that struck here. We lost more than 200 military and one woman, Jeanette Zinn, in World War I. And that was in about a year. Some of those died in combat. Some of those died in, from the Spanish flu. I'm going to read in a second an account where brother versus brother, they literally brothers fought brothers. Remember, we had a big German, still have a big German population in York County. So we had a lot of relatives back in Germany who were fighting in World War I. We were fighting the Germans in World War I. So we literally had brother versus brother. And then the Spanish flu came, and we don't have good numbers about how many died, but we think that one number we've seen is 300 died in York City alone. And we had 6,500 infected in the pandemic. Had set up a tent hospital, and the Black community was disproportionately impacted there. We had 20 people at one moment in one neighborhood who died from this terrible pandemic. I looked at just in the Spring Grove area at the deaths in World War I, and you can see here what it was a big toll, and 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 people. What struck me in this case, and I didn't count places like Seven Valleys and others in the region, but you can see what struck me here was look at the little village of Marburg that lost 2 people in World War I, either to the flu or in combat. Marburg now is under the Lake Marburg, the state, Cador State Park. And so you imagine a village, and just look at the numbers we lost in Spring Grove. Now in the current war, if we lose one person, it's a big deal, and it is a big deal. When we lose someone in Middle East fighting, and we've lost about more than 30 since 1990 in Middle East fighting. But look, in just this one year period, 10 people from this area, 2 people from the little village of Marburg. Big price we paid. Here's the brother versus brother angle. And I think the Singer family may be from the Spring Grove area, from that part of the county. And you all might know Rebecca Little Singer, who just died within not long ago. Rebecca Little Singer, I'll just read this, a former York County resident, returns in 1945 from Germany. Little was caught in Germany with her German-born husband after Hitler declared war. We're talking about World War II now. Her 2 sons served on opposite sides, and her husband was a German soldier in World War I and World War II. So in both cases, it was his brother versus brother. Excuse me. One son, Peter, fought with the German army on the Russian front. This is World War II, and is listed as missing in action at that time. Herman, the American son, is stationed as a civilian employee in the air depot at Middletown up in Dauphin County. Rebecca Little Singer was torn between family love and loyalty to her country. So here she was, an American living in Germany, married to a German, losing her sons, in combat and because of the fray of war. You can just see, can't you, that what the price has been in the past. Not that we didn't know this, but it's always good to be reminded. There was this terrible case of the Withers from York, who were serving side by side, fighting side by side. A shell came in and killed them both. The same shell killed them both in World War I. One died immediately, the other died soon thereafter. They brought their bodies back to York County for burial. I don't mean this to be one dismal story after another. I'm just trying to point out, and I'd be remiss in pointing out that after World War I, we had the Roaring '20s where we seemed to recover. And, after the World War II, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, that we came into the 1950s, and the Greatest Generation really led us out of that war, what we know as latest generation today. I'll just point out here that we have a connection with World War I and World War II here in the Spring Grove area. We have, the field piece that sits out in Jefferson Square is a World War I field piece. That's to the right. Spring Grove's field piece off to the left was scrapped during World War II. So those are artifacts, one here, one gone, that connect us with those two wars. Okay, now we're moving to another big moment. We're racing ahead. We'll get back to World War II in a second. We're racing ahead here to the late 60s. We had the revolts, the race riots in York County in 68 and 69. That was kind of a culmination of years and years of injustice, lack of services for people of color, and access to health care. Many things came out of that. Many good things came out of that, the late 60s, the riots. But we can't forget how serious they were. We have York College's Peter Levy, who said York experienced the 26th most severe riot or urban revolt out of over 500 that occurred in the nation between 63 and 72. Adjusted for population, York's revolt may have been the most severe of the era. We had Tropical Storm Agnes after that, and and that displaced families, ruined property, killed people. The Spring Grove area was severely hit. Gladfeller's flooded. We have this public health report about Agnes. The recovery period following a natural disaster is a critical time with respect to health status of the disaster victims. In many ways, a series of stressful consequences, such as unemployment, monetary loss, and so on, work on damaged dwelling units and temporary living conditions encountered during this period may be perceived by the victims as a second disaster. I think out of the riots, there were reforms that came about. We had health reforms, we had housing reforms, we had transportation reforms, we had agencies created to take care or to address some of those needs. So there's always good that's coming out of these tough moments. But you can see these were very tough moments. In fact, we'll drop back to these wars again: the Korean War, the modern wars, the Vietnam War, the Middle East, and we can see that in the Korean War we lost 2 from Spring Grove. Earl Markle was in the news. You might remember Earl Markle was in the news, and he was killed in Korea. His remains were brought back here to York County in the last couple of years after some negotiations with the North Korean government. And you can see at Vietnam what a what a tremendous loss it was. In the Middle East, Luke Runyon from Spring Grove died in 2008, in Middle East fighting in Iraq. So you can see big losses in those wars as well. We paid a terrible price in wars. Now I'll go back to World War II, because we want to talk about several things. We want to talk about the Great Depression. We want to talk about polio, and we want to talk about World War II itself. And we'll just glance at the Great Depression. It was a tough moment here. Some people say, well, no, none of the banks in York failed, so therefore, it pinched, but it didn't punch. But people that say that forgotten that banks failed out in the communities. We suffered. There's great suffering in the Great Depression. In fact, World War II is what brought us out of the Great Depression. World War II was no picnic. We lost almost as many as we did in the Civil War, 570 dead, many, many more wounded. Our family structures were disrupted. What is often overlooked here is that people didn't always follow the rules in World War II. We think World War II is what a great moment. We came together as a country. We had the York Plan. That was a great moment of our industries coming together to build things that the military needed in the worst way. We came together to do that. Gladfelder was part of that. York Corporation was part of that. All of our big companies were part of that. It was a great coming together in many ways. We had a two-front war. Really, the nation, the world hung in a balance, literally. At the same time, here locally, and this happened in every community, we had cheating on rationing. We had a black market that was burgeoning. We had a terrible prostitution problem, because families were disrupted, and so some of the prostitutes were teenagers, and there's terrible VD issues, venereal disease issues. In fact, the venereal disease was so immense that there was concern, as you can imagine, there was concern what's going to happen if this does get out of control, and our factories are affected. We can't carry on in our factories. How are we going to make the things the military needs? We've got to get this under control. So I think sometimes this applies so directly to where we are today, because, we tend to get frustrated today because, because people aren't following what the governor says, or we aren't following the rules. And or some people aren't, and other people get frustrated at that, and it makes matters tough for them. But I think we can look at any war, any moment like this, and see that people don't follow the rules in a crisis. And that I want to set the bar high. I don't want to lower the bar and say it's okay. It's not. But we should look at this and say, even at this time when the world was hanging in balance, we had widespread prostitution and so on. We cheated. We borrowed food stamps or stole food stamps. There's one case where Gladfelder was printing rationing coupons, and somehow some of those rationing coupons got into the possession of black marketers. And it was said that there was enough, according to one account I read, there's enough rationing coupons to kind of drain the available oil resources on the East Coast, because Gladfelder would have, made the paper, for a lot of these products, So, we were very much involved in that, so just take heart if people don't always follow the rules today. It's not acceptable, but we need to take heart that they didn't in the past either, unfortunately. Well, let's talk about, I wanted to show you talk about polio at a little length, because that is on target with this public health crisis that we're involved right now. And in the polio outbreak, about every year we would have polio outbreaks up until the time that the vaccine came into play in the early to mid 50s. In this 1941 outbreak, 9 died. There's more than 90 cases, and 48 of those cases were the crippling variety. This is just in 1 year. So think about this for a second. Here we were in 1941. We were struggling with the Great Depression still. We were coming out of, we had a polio epidemic, and then Pearl Harbor happened, all in 1941. We think about 2020 being a terrible year. Well, look what was happening here: depression, a polio outbreak, and we jumped into the war. We were pulled into the war because of Pearl Harbor. Now, polio was a major concern throughout World War II. And, here I have the case here of the H.J. Freezer Company that made shirts, military shirts, and they had one polio death in 1944 at that factory. It was a Gold Star factory. I mean, I think it was they received the Star for Excellence they were a high performing factory. And someone from Jacobus, it was a worker from Jacobus who was exposed to polio, and it shut down the plant. And they sent 300 workers home because they couldn't afford, they had the same types of things that we're doing today. So you can see why polio remained a concern throughout the war. So we had prostitution, we had polio, we had the black market, we had cheating on rationing, we had all this stuff. 1941 was a tough year. And so we'll talk about, go back to polio in a second, but I want to show kind of the human toll here of World War II. And this is what from one community, or one general community. We know that Alan Beck, we are familiar with him because his name is on the VFW there in Spring Grove. And you can see other fatalities. One of the key things that W.L. Gladfelder, those who know about Gladfelders, the Gladfelder family would be aware that he was one of the heirs of the Gladfelder family. He was a brother, I think, of PH2. And so there are 4 brothers, he died in a plane crash. That war really took a toll on all families, all classes, all races, then throughout the entire community. More than 600 died in World War II. You can see the toll in Spring Grove. There's other churches, just looking at a church point of view, just one church, St. Paul's Evangelical Church, which is now St. Paul's United Methodist in Redline. I think it was 11 people died in that one church, so, those are difficult moments, and yet we came through it. I want to run through the polio cases, a couple polio cases here, just to kind of make points about polio at the, how bad it was. And these are just newspaper clippings, and this shows how arbitrary and capricious polio was. Here we have one family, we have twins. One twin, I think this is a Shiloh family. One twin died, the other twin lived. And then another case, the polio tended to affect young people in the same way the Spanish flu tended to affect young people, 30 and below. Here we have B.G. Blevins in this clipping from Dover. He's a father of 9 children, was stricken with polio. And so it affected young, it affected old, it affected fathers of 9, it affected infants. It was a terrible disease. We have a case, this was a case, the 90th case. This is the first that involved a person of color, a Black person. His 18-month-year-old boy who died, from this. I often will ask if anybody knows any of these folks. Let's talk about them into Q&A time. Talk about them now if you want to. But it's always interesting to talk to family members who recognize a loved one who died in these times. So if you're connected or related to any of these folks, just let us know, and let's talk about them. Polio did prey on children. This just is striking. Whenever you go through the microfilm or newspapers.com today, when you come across this picture, this was the 9th victim to die. And there was a 12-year-old, and I don't know what it was, it's just maybe because this is such an everyday picture. This could be anybody's sister or anybody's daughter. It's so arbitrary the way the polio paralysis, well, the way it hit. And this is Ethel Schweitzer from, she's from West College Avenue. It sounded like she's from York, who died. It just hit everybody and anybody. This was Marlene Miller. I point this out because you can kind of read the font type there as I'm talking. This was Marlene Miller. And notice that Marlene Miller, daughter of Mrs. Raymond Miller of Shiloh, dies less than 10 hours after being stricken. And, so it would, you could be fine at one moment and then be very, very deathly sick the next. And what happened was, at that time, and we'll talk about this in a second, all these victims had to be taken. There weren't enough iron lungs locally to take care of people. So all these victims had to be rushed up to Harrisburg where they had enough iron lungs. The iron lungs were kind of like the ventilators of the day, your iron lungs. You can see 3 iron lungs will arrive today. So here we are, well into this epidemic of 1941, and we still don't have the material, the machinery needed to get kids better. And so you wonder, well, why didn't they just do it? We run into that right now, aren't we? Why don't we just get enough vaccine in and vaccinate and take care of this problem? And there's all kinds of reasons for that. Maybe no good reason, but there's a lot of reasons for it. That happened back in 1941 too. And really what was happening was, what happened in those days was 1941, 20 years before that with the Spanish flu, it was known that there was an isolation wing at York Hospital, which was then located on West College Avenue. The hospital would, so there was no isolation wing, even though they had fair warning in 1919. So here we are in 1941, 20 years later, and we still don't have an isolation wing. The hospital would not accept polio patients and had no suitable iron lung. They had iron lungs of different, you had to have different sizes of iron lungs depending on the size of the person inflicted. So they didn't have iron lungs, I think in this case, for young people. So we weren't ready, even though we had summer after summer of polio, we weren't ready for this pandemic or this epidemic that hit us. So patients had to be transported to Harrisburg. And, today you can get on 83 and get up to Harrisburg in 25 minutes or 30 minutes. In those days, you had to take the Susquehanna Trail, which went all the way through Strinestown and up, through York Haven and wound around. And it took and meanwhile you had the ambulances weren't as fast. You had to wander your road, and it took you a while to get up there until you could get these young people to get treatments. So, here we are, we just couldn't, there was a lot of different finger pointing that went on as to why we didn't have an isolation hospital. Here we are in 1947 still, 6 years after this 1941 epidemic, and we still didn't have an isolation wing, which would have had all the equipment needed to take care of polio and other infectious diseases like that. And so during a meeting a high-level meeting, it was reported that there was a polio death in 1947 that helped swing the vote in order to get, an isolation wing. And an isolation hospital wing went in 1949 at York Hospital. And they accepted patients before they officially opened. The need was such. A rich donor came forward and helped to write that hospital wing. So sometimes, you could say that some people will say no good crisis should go to waste. That sometimes you can bring about change. A crisis brings about change in the same way that the 1969 riots brought about change. Here we have a case again where these yearly epidemics finally reached a tipping point and brought about change in the form of an isolation hospital, wing of a hospital at York Hospital. So even in those days, we had trouble, delivering stuff in a timely manner, just like we may be facing right now with the vaccine. So we'll just go over some quickly here, some lessons from history, and we'll be wrapping up here in just a few minutes. We are going to experience bad moments because of our geography, because we're in the middle of things, we're close to things, we're close to a lot of population. We have a lot of population ourselves. We have a big county to cover. We're not just some isolated county in the middle of, nowhere. We're right in the thick of the mid-Atlantic area here. So we're just going to have things that happen to us here, just like we've already talked about for the last half an hour. As with the rest of America, we need to get past our political differences at time of crisis, particularly locally. We need to develop strong relationships in peacetime so we can rely on each other in war. That sounds easy. It sounds nice, but it's really hard to do. Here we have this picture here kind of speaks to that in a way, because we have all these guys huddling around a table. This is called the York Plan, where right in the middle, or right in early parts of World War II, the industry started developing relationships with each other into what became the York Plan. And so whenever a big contract came in, you had all these CEOs that we see in the picture of New York Wire and York Corporation and Gladfelder, they came together, and there they are poring over blueprints. And you have the chief architect of the York Plan there at the end of the table, W.S. Shipley from York Corporation, sitting at the end of the table, looking at these specs and blueprints himself. He was an engineer. And so he was actually doing real work there in looking at these contracts, the specs that they would have to deliver if they were going to get a particular contract. But you can see the cooperation that took place there in the early years of World War II. And so I think that speaks to number two pretty plainly. We should have high expectations for our neighbors, realizing that even in our toughest moments, World War II, for example, we make mistakes, but we can do better. So, I've already spoken 2 or 3 times about how people didn't follow the rules in this terrible war, World War II. We came together in many ways. We didn't come together in other ways. And, but we shouldn't lower our expectations, but we should understand that happens as long as we have, humans, fallible human beings that make mistakes. That might help our frustrations a little bit if we realize that in other times of crisis, we didn't come together completely either. In our more decentralized community structure, who is in charge countywide? I think it's a fair question to ask. Who's in charge? Who has a loud and effective voice? Who are many effective voices better? That relates to, you can relate that to our community today, where there are big needs, and who's in leadership positions in our communities who are speaking a loud voice about, things that need to be done. We should have a series of community-wide public reviews. At some point, we ought to talk about, the pandemic and really what we did right, what we did wrong. And in business, in our lives, what can we draw from this crisis to improve ourselves on the other side? So I'll go over a couple things very, very quickly here. Things that emerged early in the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic. One was that a task force recommended a countywide health department, and that's under review by the county commissioners. But there's a case where we had a crisis and we had a recommendation to move ahead something that is needed. Some would say is needed, that would help provide that loud voice that we may be lacking right now in the middle of this pandemic. And then there's a call for addressing, after the George Floyd incident, the George Floyd murder, that we needed a countywide human relations commission. And here we have a call for that. And commissioners came up with 2 county employees to address discrimination. There's not a commission. They didn't come up with a commission, but they did move towards appointing 2 employees to address this lingering problem of racial discrimination in York County. there has been innovation in York County and the region as a result of the pandemic. One is that some distilleries are making sanitizers nowadays. They made alcohol of various types, and then now they're putting clean, and they're still doing this, putting detergents in there or things that will kill germs, disinfectants in there. And so they adjusted that way. My favorite example was, the Presto franchise that started. This was Two Tonys in York, a high-end restaurant that took over an old Brewster's in West York and have a drive-through Italian pasta restaurant. So, you can just go through there and, and order a pasta, Italian fare. I haven't personally seen a drive-through Italian eatery yet. I have used this one, and it's top notch. It's really good. But so they took, to steal a bad cliche, they are faced with lemonade, and they're faced with lemons, and they made lemonade out of it. And so if we can look at these terrible moments in that way, how can we better ourselves as humans? How can we better our company or the people we're connected with? How can we better each other? That may be the best way to view these very, very tough moments. And there's none other than, this is the kind of the concluding slide here, none other than P.H. Gladfelder did that very thing. P.H. Gladfelder, according to Jeffrey Rogan, who wrote the kind of the story of Gladfelder, P.H. Gladfelder lost 3 of his children to various diseases, and here we are in the 1890s, and his lumber company is doing well there in Spring Grove, and he had always had some interest, or in the last decade, he had some interest in what is then known as York Manufacturing, later became known as York Ice and Yorko and Johnson Controls and York International, and now Johnson Controls today. And so is the late 1890s, and they were struggling. York Manufacturing was struggling, and they'd had a couple of very warm summers, warm winters. And so what happened in those days is they would harvest ice from ponds, big chunks of ice, and pack them in leaves and sawdust and put them in buildings. And that's how you got your ice for the summer. And you had warm winters, and you didn't have the ice that could cool things in the summer. So we ended up having problems with typhoid and other types of digestive type of issues like that. And so he looked at that. He knew he had lost some of his own children to the childhood diseases. So he started investing more heavily in York Manufacturing, which made refrigeration equipment. Still makes refrigeration equipment and cooling equipment. So that's what got him involved. And he stepped the amount of his investment in York Manufacturing. He knew that refrigeration equipment was going to be needed more and more as population grew, and the winters, I keep saying summers, the winters were so unpredictable. So he invested heavily, brought in Tom Shipley from Frick in Waynesboro, Franklin County, brought him in. Tom's brother, W.S. Shipley, came in, the rest is history. So P.H. Gladfelder not only, ran successfully his papermaking company, but he also saved York Manufacturing at a time of crisis, and it's still around today. Both companies are still around today. And he kind of adapted in the middle of a crisis to a solution. So he did the very thing that in some ways Tony Calderon is doing off to the right there, by in the middle of a crisis, when your high-end restaurant is shut down, then you start a different model. And it probably is going to be, just opened a new branch the other day in East York. So, so that's my presentation. It's just trying to offer some degree of hope or redemption in these tough times. And the idea that, look, we've gone through these in the past, and if we keep our head and we look for ways to make to adapt and to make things better, then we can do that and come out the other side okay. Still very painful. I'm not discounting that, what we're going through, but it does offer, by looking at these examples from the past, it does offer hope for the future. So that's my presentation, Blake. I'm glad to answer questions or really talk about this as we go.
Yeah, we had a quiet group and everything.
Yeah.
Does anyone have any questions for Jim before we wrap everything up? There, Holly said, thank you for an inspiring presentation.
Thank you. When you take everything together, look at what we've been through as one community, one York County, and Spring Grove's been a part of that. All of our towns, York, big and small, have been through it. It is pretty amazing when you string it all together, what we have really faced. Now, some of the rest of the nation had polio as well, but we obviously had numerous years of it. I'm not sure if it's our climate here or what, but it affected us in a big way. And so, again, our geography has a lot to do with a lot of these stories that we've talked about today, but we've made it through.
Jim, what would you say would be the number one worst event, I guess, or whatever you want to call it, that York County has gone through?
When you really assess all of these, they've all been difficult, but I would say the Civil War has been the most difficult, because there you have the enemy, the people we were fighting, yielding guns, and they were foreign country, really. They were fellow Americans, or were before the war, but they were our enemies, and they were quite capable of killing us if we were provoked them. And plus, we also had they just stole horses and trampled our crops, and our horses were important because those were our tractors, and they trampled our crops. They really, the women who were left here, a lot of the guys were away at war, were terrorized by these guys on horseback and and on foot. In York, they stayed in York for almost 2 days. So imagine for a full weekend having an enemy, in our midst. So I think that because the enemy came here, that would elevate it maybe above the rest. In the other cases, those were terrible. We were getting daily reports of loved ones who died. I'm sure that they were notified by telegram first, but these 600 men who died in World War II, the women, those at home, the families received telegrams, but then it was in the paper so people saw who else had been affected, but that was a little bit more distant. The enemy wasn't here doing the killing, or the enemy wasn't here causing the terror. So I think for that reason, I would say the Civil War would have been something. Plus, we lost, more than 600 people in the Civil War. It disrupted our families so tremendously in that way, so much that we had to form an orphanage to take care of those families. I would say the Civil War was the worst.
Okay, does anyone else have any questions for Jim or anything? Looks like just compliments for you, Jim. I guess you can handle those.
I appreciate that. Yeah, thank you.
All right. Well, again, let me thank Tracy with Windy Hill on the campus in Spring Grove for setting this up for us. As always, you can find Jim on Retro York on Facebook. He's always posting things on there. I don't think he ever sleeps. It seems like as much as he posts on there. You can check us out on Facebook, the Spring Grove Area Historical Preservation Society. Our website's getting a makeover right now, so that'll be back. And we've been on our page. I've been scanning a lot of photos with a new scanner that we got recently, and posting on our page, and getting people to help us identify some of the places and the people that are in those photos, and just getting everybody's stories that they have about the events that are going on in them. So yeah, just check us out and everything too. And with that, I guess we'll wrap everything up. So thanks a lot for coming out, everyone, and try and make it through the whatever snowfall we get in the next couple of days, and be safe.
Thank you.